Hello, everybody. Good morning, and thanks so much for joining us today. So this morning session is going to be called the Civil Rights and Culture Shift. If I can ask folks to kind of move up towards the front, because we are going to ask some audience participation by asking a few questions. So we're going to maybe ask for volunteers, or at least ask each other some questions, because we really want you to really think about how this really will inform the work that we do. So I'm going to start off. My name is Mike Chin, pronouns he, him, and I'm the Civil Rights Enforcement Director at the Seattle Office for Civil Rights.
All right. Hey, everybody. I'm John Page. I'm the Community Investments Division Director. Thank y'all for coming and checking out what we're about to put down.
All right. So I will just begin by saying that when Mary approached John and I to present this morning on civil rights, as well as some other topics around equality, equity, the first thing that came to mind was this was the first time I've been invited to come and actually share some information at a summit, and so that's a great privilege to be asked. But the second thing was to actually work with John Page. And so this is our first presentation together, and I'm really excited because so much of what we talk about, our history, our present, and our future, is really thinking about how our work really works together. This is also an opportunity to kind of do some self-reflection. It's not just to learn about civil rights and about culture shift, it's also to think about what are some opportunities where we need to do some growing, and how does this apply to our work in the RSGI world.
So y'all, I'm gonna have to play with this mic with Mike. So thinking about the learning outcomes, what we're hoping folk to walk away with in this session is understand the importance of civil rights laws in creating equal opportunities, but also understanding that it's not the end of the story, right? So we think about what's the culture shift that happens? What happens in the culture as a result of these laws, right? You know, give you a quick example. I'm going to date myself a little bit. So Brown versus Board 1 happened in 1954. That was the law that desegregated schools. And I'm from the South. I'm from Texas, right? And so I was born in 64. So I was born about 10 years after the legislation was enacted. In Dallas, schools didn't start to be desegregated till 1976. I was in the 6th grade when they started busing, and it was just one way, right? So when you think about that, the law happened. So what happened in the culture, in society, to make that law actionable, right? And to see it in folks' lives. And I guess the final thing, I want to think about what's the culture shift that needs to happen around RSGI as we do this work in the city of Seattle?
All right. So I'm going to really talk a little bit about kind of what it was the lead up to the Civil Rights Act. And this legislation passed in 1964 was probably one of the biggest pieces of legislation that really changed the laws in employment, in housing, in public accommodations, and in voting. But I think it's really important to kind of acknowledge that the lead up to the Civil Rights Act wasn't just what was happening in the 1960s, but also acknowledge the slavery that was happening in the United States and around the world from 1619 to 1863. When we think about access, when we think about harm to communities of color, especially Black and brown populations, it's so important to acknowledge the history that was tied in and the harmful history that still exists today. And even though in 1863, with President Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 200 years after, things had not gotten better. Maybe the freedom of slavery, but it didn't actually mean that we were free to have the power to vote, to have access to education, access to jobs, and so forth. Really, what was happening was a movement of the people, especially young people, to change our society and to really think about how do we end segregation? How do we remove poll taxes and literacy tests? And how do we achieve equality and access to some of the basic fundamental access to housing and to employment and to be able to vote? These are some of the images that I had an opportunity with John and I to go to the South. And some of these are actually photos that we took with the Empower Initiative to really think about our history and how that informed the civil rights movement. I think this was also the first time, John talked about growing up in Texas. I grew up in Moscow, Idaho, 10 years after John. And actually, this was the first time I actually had that awakening of what it was like before the civil rights laws were passed. And you don't realize the harm that has been happened and the harm that still exists today by government, by businesses, by workplaces. And even though we have the Civil Rights Act and we've had the civil rights movement, it took hundreds of years to actually achieve to where we are today. Also, this year is a really important year because this is the 60th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act that was signed into law on July 2nd. Why this is important is not just about the ability to be prohibited from discrimination in employment, which most people think about. There were several different aspects of the Civil Rights Act that tried to address the disparities and discrimination and tried to remove segregation from voting, from public places, from desegregation of public facilities, education, the creation of the Civil Rights Commission, non-discrimination in federally assisted programs such as the City of Seattle and the State of Washington, and the creation of the equal employment opportunity to enforce the federal laws that prohibit discrimination. And this was not just the only piece of federal legislation that was passed after John F. Kennedy's death. 1965, next year, will be the 60th anniversary of the Voter Rights Act. In 1968 will be the Fair Housing Act. And what we're going to be talking a little bit about in the next slides is that even though we have these laws that prohibited discrimination, de jure discrimination and de facto discrimination, which means by law you could discriminate or society could discriminate, we're really going to be focusing on how is that really changing what we are experiencing today. So I want to really point this out because in Seattle, similar to the Race and Social Justice Initiative, that's very unique to Seattle, the civil rights laws and protections in the city of Seattle is also very, very different, and it's very jurisdictional. So although we have federal laws to prohibit discrimination based on race, color, national origin, which later included religion, sex, age, and disability, we also have city ordinances that prohibit discrimination based on additional 20 protected classes. So when we think about discrimination, we have to think about, are these protections just in the city of Seattle, or is it on the state level, or on the federal level? And all these protected classes prohibit discrimination in employment, housing, public places, and in contracting.
Right on, Mike. Thank you. So what are we talking about when we talk about culture shift? Again, we're talking about what actually happens. How does that law actually and that rule actually hit the ground, right? What's the material, tangible changes we see in society? So we think about the norms, our beliefs, how we talk about a thing, right? How we engage with a thing, right? And really what we're talking about is, so those laws kind of socialize us and condition us to think about things in certain ways. Would that be sort of fair to say? Would folks say that's fair? So even though we have these laws, in Dallas, they were like, shoot, we're going to keep these schools segregated, right? Yeah, we know we have a law, So what had to happen for folk to say, okay, we're going to really integrate schools? And so we think about, so we have a couple of definitions, right? Culture shift, I'm just going to read it. Culture shift refers to significant changes in society's values, norms, beliefs, behaviors, arts, literature, or any aspect that shapes collective identity. As Americans, as Seattleites, right? As men, as women, as cisgendered men, women, cisgendered folk, heterosexual, LGBTQ. And so we got some examples. Think about the telephone, think about material examples, but what are the non-material examples of shifts in the culture? Mike, can you go to the next slide? So thinking about protections around public spaces, right? So disability rights, religious freedom, LGBTQ plus rights, immigrant rights, gender identity protections. Mike, can you go to the next slide? Thank you. Actually, go back to the other slide. Actually. So I just have a couple of examples under all these, thinking about what the law, what the culture shift was that reflected the law. And we think about, just recognizing the rights and dignity of people with disabilities. So we start seeing ramps, right? We start seeing spaces being made, for instance, the spaces here. Even though we had the law, it took a minute for us to do this, right? For us to say, hey, we're going to make these places, these public spaces, welcoming and accessible, right? It's one thing to say you have this law and then you have to go to a public space and advocate and remind folk that there is a law. But there's something else that needed to happen for us to really make it accessible and welcoming for folk with disabilities. Thinking about religious freedoms. So looking at stuff like allowing prayer in school. Think about religious symbols in public spaces. And then this, I'm going to tell on myself a little bit, but I'm going to tell on us, really. So we got this thing around separation of church and state, right? Right? I don't know what that means, really, because whenever we have a real tragedy, right? And pretend I'm President Page, right? And so what's the first thing I'm going to say to acknowledge that tragedy? God bless the survivors, the victims, and I'm the president. I'm the man that represents this branch of government. So what does it really mean when we talk about a separation of church and state? That's just a little tangent I like to kind of interrogate. I hadn't figured it out. I'm just going to tell you. But it's still curious to me that we talk like that. LGBTQ rights, the Obergefell versus Hodges, which happened in 2015, and it's public accommodation laws, and the way the culture shift looked was against discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity in places like hotels, restaurants, and other public venues. So I'm gonna give y'all a preview of the test. We're gonna ask y'all to name some ways that culture shift has happened around RSJI, and then what still needs to happen. Because would it be fair to say in Seattle, the city that I love, I'm gonna clown a little bit, but in liberal Seattle, that we have the language, right? We have the social justice, racial equity language, but have we really internalized it? If somebody didn't know we had this language and they came to Seattle, would they think that we had an RSJI? Would they think that equity really, really mattered to us? So look at disparities around, name something, education, healthcare, criminal justice, home ownership, economic disparities. So what needs to happen, even though we have an RSJI, It's been around for 20 years. There's something else that needs to happen, right? And what I'm going to put forth is sort of some internalizing of what these really mean. I think the previous panelists talked about this. I think we'll get stuck if we're not figuring out how this applies, because there's this term of jumping over the church to get to the church, right? And so what that means is I'm an RSJI practitioner, right? And so I'm setting up RFPs to be accessible, low barriers, right? But then I'm giving this person in the cubicle right next to me the blues, right? And so what happens to RSJI and what I've internalized about RSJI? So RSJI really is still theoretical or it's technical. And sometimes I think we struggle, and that's why the work has to be inside, but sometimes we struggle with materially and internally and emotionally, how do we adopt and live by RSJI principles? How do they show up? So Mike, can you go to the next slide, please? What is the next slide? So Mike, actually, okay, this is yours. You were going to talk about this?
All right. And like what John was saying, think about the space that we are here. This is the public space. And can you imagine a place where it excluded people who look like me, or look like you, or look like John, or people with disabilities? I mean, even though we had these laws as a foundation of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, but did it create a culture shift today? Because I think that's the distinction about culture shift. Is like what John said, it's more than just what the law says. It's the shift of attitudes, behaviors, and values and principles. Because even though these laws say you can't do this, is it really shifting the culture to really embrace this, to ensure that everybody has an opportunity to be at the table? When we talk about state and local government, which was part of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, why was this in place? What was happening in the 1960s and the 50s and the 40s? Government, cities, states use federal funds to discriminate. I remember a story where they said, you know what? In the South, they said, we're going to close these public pools if we have to open them for black people. We're going to close this public zoo if I have to be in the same space as a person of color. What the Civil Rights Act tried to say is that you cannot do that. It tried to say that if you are receiving federal funds, like the city of Seattle, like the state of Washington, like all 50 states, you cannot discriminate based on race, color, and national origin. When we also think about gender equity, when we think about access to so many services, it also applied based on sex. So even though you have state law that said something different, you had politicians saying we're going to exclude people, but we're okay with accepting your money, federal government. That's where the rub happened with Title VI.
So I'm going to try something a little interactive. I want folk to just turn to whoever you're sitting next to and just think about the culture shift, and I've named some of them, right? Think about RSJI and what some of the culture shifts that has happened, that needs to happen to move the work forward. And so we don't have a slide on RSJI. Mike, do we have an RSJI slide? Go to that end. Go to the outside. So these are the questions we want folk to think about, right? And then we're going to come back. We'll just probably give you 10 minutes, give folks 10 minutes to think about culture shift as it applies to RSJI. Is that clear to folk? That's clear? Thank you, Mehdi. Is that clear? Fahima, who are you going to talk to? You going to talk to her? Fahima, you may want to go to the row behind you. So can folk just turn to somebody next to them and just talk about RSJI and culture shift and how do we move this work forward? First of all, what needs to happen? And what would be some indicators that we've shifted, that we've sort of internalized, and it's not a theoretical exercise, right? It's not just an initiative, but an ordinance now. But how do we really, really, really implement and make it actionable? So we give you about 10 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes. It depends on how fruitful. And I'm going to come out and help folk and talk to folk, and we'll figure it out.